Hello. In episode 109 of Heirs for Architecture, Mallory Baches, president of the Congress for the New Urbanism, speaks with me about her journey through architecture to urban design, planning and community development, the ideas, ethics and goals of the CNU.
Heirs for Architecture, a podcast about architecture, buildings, urban culture and space.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Heirs for Architecture. I'm talking today to Mallory Baches, architect, urbanist, designer. Mallory, could you introduce yourself a little more fully than that, please?
Absolutely. I'm trained as an architect. I went to architecture school, but I knew pretty early in that education that I was much more interested in where the buildings fit into the rest of the city than exactly how to build the buildings. And so I sort of worked during my undergraduate studies, at that intersection between the sort of schematic design of the buildings and then how they fit into the larger context surrounding them, and went straight out of school into in the States and in some places internationally, a pretty well-known urban design, architecture and urban design firm, Dwani Plater Zyberk. The two principals, Andreas Dwani and Elizabeth Plater Zyberk, were two of the founders of the organization I now am the president of. So I sort of learned from a very, very early age from them and some of their peers and colleagues, and have practiced urban design until I came back to this organization, which is called the Congress for the New Urbanism. And we are a national membership-based nonprofit that works on advocating for more walkable, more sustainable, more equity-supportive cities. And we have international members as well. There's some folks in the UK and around Europe, definitely, that are very active and engaged with our organization, and other continents and fields afar as well. And I think my practice when I began as a young urban designer was I was always curious about a broader world than the one I was living in and working in, the one I grew up in. Here in the U.S., there's so many lessons to learn from cities well beyond our borders. And so I was very lucky when I came to Dwani Plater Zyberk, DPZ, that we did quite a bit of international work then, and I carried that on in my own practice, and even did a master's in sustainable urban development in the UK. And so that's the sort of environment where, if you're talking about sustainability on a global scale, you've moved well beyond the realm of the town you live in, and are thinking about really complex problems that interconnect all of us all around the globe.
That's a wonderful introduction. Thank you for that. I came upon you through Dolores Hayden, who I had pestered for conversation, and she hadn't been so willing. And eventually she said, well, look, I'm retired and I don't want to talk about it. So I suggest you contact Mallory.
I mean, an extraordinary compliment, just that she would have my name somewhere in her Rolodex.
Isn't that, well, anyway, I know. And I was wondering whether you could, perhaps through this conversation, try to unpack where that comes from. And the reason I ask is because in the UK, when I first came across the idea of new urbanism, it was in a very contested way. People were challenging it. They were unhappy with the idea. This was in the early 2000s. They felt it was traditionalist, conservative, with a big C as well as a small c, anti-modern, many things. And yet Dolores Hayden is obviously a bit of a stalwart and a bit of a totem for what we might see as a more progressive idea. So I was quite interested in this, and I was wondering whether perhaps you had any insight into that.
Yeah, well, it's interesting to think, as I was describing sort of my professional journey, that the way I might have answered that question when I started my career 25 plus years ago is probably quite different from today. And I think that's a byproduct of the fact that when we're talking about new urbanism, talking about a movement of I mentioned we're a membership-based nonprofit, Congress for the New Urbanism, CNU, as I'll probably defer to the acronym from here on out. But this movement of practitioners that we represent, that we are the gathering point for, the landscape, the context in which the change that this group has been seeking has evolved over 30 years. The first, we have an annual Congress, which is our coming together. It's why our name is as it is. And it is not a conference. It is an intentional gathering to debate and discuss and to innovate in collective fashion and to identify new avenues for change or identify new problems that need to be addressed and innovate around those. And the first Congress was held in 1993 in Alexandria, Virginia. And it was a gathering of individuals, whether they were urban designers or architects or transportation officials or developers, real estate developers, elected officials were there, federal officials were there, the Secretary of HUD, Health, there were mayors, the mayor of Charleston, South Carolina, it occurs to me, quite a lot of different folks who were struggling, were wrestling with the fact that so much development that was happening was being done in an entirely car-centric, car-prioritized fashion, and with complete isolation from one use to the next, and in conflict with the way cities had been built up until that point for millennia. And so in initially coming together, these were folks who each in their practice may have explored the idea that there was a better way, or that we could return to a better way, or learn from the ways of the past to do better into the future. They each might have explored that in their individual practice, but the coming together was to share ideas and knowledge. There was a lot of relearning that was happening in the earliest days of the Urbanist movement. And like I mentioned, a lot of that relearning was looking back at the patterns that have been successful and understanding why they were successful. Why is London there, and why has it changed in the ways that it's changed over the years and continued to grow and evolve? And then in what ways has that growth and evolution inhibited the best interest of the city or of the people who live there, the livability of it or the economic prosperity of the city? Really pick that understanding apart, and in order to develop better solutions going forward. And so where I think that sort of conservatism, it seems to have really been identified by some folks, is that there was a looking to the past, but it was a looking to the past with the intention to improve upon the future, not with some, look back and return to and blinders to the limitations that past might have offered, or the social constructs, the legal constructs that were problematic or intentionally unequal that might have been a part of those. In the U.S. for quite a while now, a big reckoning has been the practice of redlining, and that real estate, entire communities, entire neighborhoods within cities were identified as poor real estate value, that effectively red lines were drawn around those Black and brown neighborhoods that, reinforced the practice of real estate segregation by doing so. By not, providing mortgages in those redlined areas, by not providing, not promoting home sale in those redlined areas. And, the generational wealth stealing that goes through that, those may still be beautifully functional urban contexts, but there's social weight, there's history, there's intentional malinvestment, there's plenty of our history is not pure. is certainly the best way to describe that. And New Urbanists were looking back at these communities not with the blinders to the difficulties or the problems that those communities had represented, but also with an understanding of the functionality of the framework that those communities might have been built on, and trying to unpack what worked, what didn't, what was successful, what wasn't, what was healthy, what was consumptive, what was extractive about these places, and learn from that in order to initially determine the principles on which our movement practices. The Charter of the New Urbanism is a document that was finalized in 1996. It was explored through those early Congresses, the first few years, and signed by the attendees at the Fourth Congress in 1996. And it's 27 principles that describe what our vision for that more walkable, more sustainable, more equitable city looks like, and how to get there, particularly how to get there through design.
That's a really good description. Thank you. The history of the New Urbanist movement starts in the post-war years, and it's to do with a disaffection with processes of, as you say, car-based modernization. So obviously the big names associated with that, Lewis Mumford, Jane Jacobs, and then latterly people like Leon Krier. Mm-hmm. Is that the lineage that you see? Is that the lineage that you fit within, this kind of anti-modernist?
I think that's a to get back to my, thinking about how I might have answered your question about conservatism differently. Yeah. In the earlier days of the movement, I think the movement probably felt much more radical, even insofar as it was looking back on on traditional models in those early days, because many of the ideas were not at all embraced by standard practice, regardless of where you were at. The idea of intentionally creating the ability for people to live car-free was really antithetical to the way we might have thought about the world and cities within them in the 90s. And so in some ways, that was a time of real radical action on the part of New Urbanists to just push against the mold and find those avenues where they could innovate or do a particular, test a particular model, identify a particular problem that there was a community happy to try an alternative. Because all of this was in the earliest days of test modeling. And now, 30 years later, the idea that we would be watching the city of Paris seek to take cars out of the center of the city, as opposed to make it more efficient for the cars to move through the center of the city, is certainly something that gets a lot of debate, but at the same time is something being taken on by the mayor and the administration of the city. And 30 years ago, there were not cities, by and large, that had any sort of that intentional prioritization. And where they did, they were extreme outliers to the rest of the business as usual happening. And so I think that the description of anti-modernist, or the description of a focus on traditional models, it can be a little bit of a misnomer, because what exactly constitutes the modern, and where exactly do we as humans fall within that landscape? And it's particularly pernicious, I think, in architecture to use the term modern or anti-modern, because of the sort of consensus around the modernist movement of architecture and that period of time, pre-war, shortly before pre-war, leading on to post-war, and that can cause a little bit of conflict when you compare that perception to, say, a young person looking to move to a new city and trying to choose what feels like the lifestyle that they want to have for themselves. Many of those young people in the US anyway, the ownership of a car and the sort of obligatory nature of being attached to a vehicle and the expense of that, the obligation of that, the limitations that that may provide is something that's very unattractive. And so is it anti-modern for a young person wanting to live a fulfilling life to also not want to do that by way of a personal vehicle that they have to own and carry the responsibility of? And I would argue it the young person is going to say it's the most modern of ways to live. And yet there is a tendency to think of that as a very neo-traditional way of existing. Before we had the convenience of the car, we had to walk everywhere. And I think that's where I'm getting at, that, to unpack that a little bit, it's a bit of a conflict. The description of the word itself is something that is interpretive.
Yeah, for sure. I get that. And it's a little bit of a red rag that I'm waving your direction because it's fun.
That's fair.
No, it's not that. I suppose it's that I was in a little town, a post-war new town recently called Harlow, north of London by about 40, 50 miles. And it was built around a core of an old village, and it was extended in the 50s, and it was a modernist town. And it was a very different animal to what we would conceive of as modernism now. It was quite chic. It was definitely walkable, although the town itself was quite spread out, and there was obviously a heavy focus on really brilliant roads. Sorry, I have to say, amazing roads. Like, you can whiz down them, wide, clear, and I appreciate that. However, it had been subsumed in subsequent years, decades, by what we might describe as modern life. So there's modernism.
Yeah.
And then there's modern life. And my feeling with, say, Jane Jacobs' arguments against Robert Moses wasn't that she was against modernism, but so much she was against a form of modernization which was technological and kind of heartless.
Yeah. Dehumanizing,
yeah.
Yeah.
But the new urbanist model does seem to tend towards more traditional design. So you used the word design earlier. And by traditional, I mean lower rise, fenestration that has a kind of public face, the use of materials which are perhaps more, less concrete. I think that might be the easiest way to say it. Less concrete, less glass and steel facades, and so on and so forth. Is this built within it?
Yeah, that's a good question. Is that part of the DNA of what this movement looks like? What the principles of new urbanism look like in built form? And I think that in some ways, the answer to the question is yes, to a point. I think that some of the very fundamental aspects, design elements of successful urbanism are utilizing forms that we tend to associate with the past. An example of that would be a front porch, front stoop, front dooryard, front, garden, where there is this sort of semi-public space between the public realm of the street and the sidewalk and the private realm of the building. And whether that building is, a freestanding single-family home, whether that's attached, whether that's a building of apartments, there's, a lot of variation in this sort of intensity of that building's use. But having that, when you're talking about space that is perceived as private on the inside, presumably residential or, perhaps, office use or something that is not of a frequent in and out fashion, that having that boundary space designed into the way the building intercepts the public realm is something that is very, we would argue as an urbanist, it improves the quality of life both of the street and of the private the private building, the existence within the private building, and then elevating that first floor up above the street height so that there is sort of the perspective of looking down, that there's a sense of safety from inside the building, of being able to see, down into the street, and that there's some sense of privacy within the building that people out on the street can't necessarily see directly into your windows. Though I immediately think of Amsterdam, and then one of my favorite things to do is to walk the streets at dusk and be able to see, and it in a cultural environment that's different, particularly from the US, that is, that's not a glitch, that's a feature that you can actually view into those Amsterdam row houses. But I would say that there are certain, and I will confide to the fact that culture plays a role in that, cultural norms play a role in that, but that there are certain design elements, the porch or all of these other examples similar to the porch that I listed, being one of them, where they tend to often feel very traditional in form, or recognizing a traditional architectural style in one way or another. And also, it's very functional. It is playing this role in terms of how you experience the spaces, whether it's from the street or whether it's from inside the building, that is important. And so when I say that I think that, yes, there is probably some aspect of traditional design that is built into the DNA of New Urbanism, I think that's what I mean. That this is, you would not qualify something as being New Urbanist simply because it uses traditional architecture. And yet there are elements that we might associate with traditional architecture that would necessarily be a part of design that was, principally New Urbanist.
The word urbanism is obviously very important here. And I've asked about architecture, but it seems to me that what you're talking about primarily is the articulation of places through the street, through the urban realm.
Yeah.
Is that the focus? Does the interest of New Urbanism really stop at the threshold of the home, recognizes these liminal spaces, these boundaries, these thresholds, which are so important in high functioning architecture, but really the interest is in the formal layout of broader urban areas?
Yes, I would say that there are aspects of the private realm that impose upon the public realm. That it would be irresponsible not to, take into consideration. But, I reference that I've been lucky to work in many countries around the world, and what you find then is that the layout of buildings, the sort of internal use of buildings, can be different from one culture to the next, or one climactic zone to the next. One sort of lifestyle, one sort of localized lifestyle. I remember when I was first working in Australia and New Zealand, and I'd come from the upper Midwest of the US, which is like, we have a brief period during the summer where we actually have, warm, enjoyable weather. And then there's a very long period of not so much. A lot of snow, less snow now. The climate change epidemic has taken away a lot of that snow. But I was unfamiliar or much less familiar with how permeable people like to live when I started doing work in Australia and New Zealand, where the climate is more moderate, particularly in areas anyway, where the climate is more moderate, and where housing design, regardless of the intensity of the sort of building structure of that, is much more intended to operate with the seasons and with the surrounding landscape than might be common in the upper Midwest of the United States. And I remember recognizing that, I'd studied housing design in my college years, in my undergraduate years, but I'd studied it in a really narrow view. I hadn't really expanded to think about how important a courtyard might be in a Mediterranean context, or in, sort of that sort of parallel around the globe. And that's the other interesting thing, is that, you can then, when you start to pick that apart, you see that people live in particular relationship to the indoors versus the out of doors in similar ways, many times despite significant cultural differences, because that housing is responsive to the local climate, the local context. And so I remember thinking a lot about the fact that the homes I was visiting, the internal spaces of buildings that I was visiting as I started to travel more in my career, were often quite different. But then when you got to the street level, with a few exceptions of things that also are often climactically related, um, but that when you got to the street level, that need to intercept public versus private realm, and that need to sort of humanize the experience of being in public, in, moving through spaces, or moving along streets, or from one district to another. That there are some consistencies there that are sort
Mm.
of, operate regardless of, the specifics of what the internal, where the kitchen is laid out relative to the living or dining in any particular home. And I think that those universalities have a lot to do with how humans over civilization have found ways to interact with each other that is supportive of community. It is encouraging of, our sort of best ideals as a species. And that is likewise where, when you insert the machinery, when you insert, the predominance of particularly personal vehicles, although, there are lots of ways that the city as a machine could be broken apart. That concept could be broken apart and really, interrogated. But when you insert that machine sort of technologically focused way of design into these places, it leads to a less successful, less human, less people focused sort of environment.
Yeah. In the document you sent through, which was let me get the title, the Congress for the New Urbanism Strategic Plan 2024 update, which I'm grateful for receiving.
Yeah.
One of the things that jumped out at me was a strong focus around regulation and policy. Is that the scale at which you want to operate? Is it not enough to operate at the level of the individual designer? Does there have to be systemic change if we're going to confront inequity, confront ecological problems? And what does this regulation look like? And the second question that I've been thinking about policy and regulation quite a lot in the last few days. I'm putting on a symposium on food poverty and policy. And I wanted to know what this policy looks like, because you also, in your document, talk about the preeminent role of collaboration with communities. And for me, there's this big disconnect, because policy is a language and a kind of intellectual knowledge form. It doesn't really talk to people.
Yeah.
It's for policymakers and very clever architects who've got time to do it, urban planners, so on and so forth. So I was wondering about these two things. What do you mean about regulatory transformation, and how is this to be realized? What's the ideal way this might be realized?
That's a great question. I really appreciate that. I will start by answering that the interesting place that many, I would not say all by any means, but many of our members, our organization's members, the unique place where they practice often touches both sides of that conundrum. They are both providing design solutions that need to be interpretive of the community's needs and wants and desires for itself, and at the same time are having to do so within a framework of what the local policy, local regulation, state, federal, in the US. And when you read that strategic plan, there is a real bias towards the context of the US in that, I will admit. But we have, multiple layers of policy and position into what the built environment actually looks like. And then that varies from one state to the next, and we have 50 of those. So the 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 ways that best design outcomes are inhibited in the US happens at regulatory scales that both the local community are directly impacted by. The local regulations are going to impact the local community. They may not necessarily, I agree with you, those policies are often not written for the local community to particularly successfully understand what their outcome might be. But they're going to impact the local community pretty significantly. But then you take that up a level to the state, and state legislation that's imposing restrictions or opening up, removing restrictions, as the case may be, to what the local communities can decide for themselves. That's another layer of regulatory potential burden. And then you get to the federal level, and you get yet another layer. And so the important reason for CNU focusing so strategically on policy is in two parts. I'll talk about the very sort of systemic way, which is that so many of the policies that in the sort of mass expansion of policy in the US was happening at the same time that the mass expansion of suburban sprawl was happening. So these two are sort of mutually self-reinforcing. And when you look at how local zoning codes, the local regulations that determine what can be built where, when you look at how those rolled out across the United States and how directly it was in concert with the expansion of the federal highway transportation system, and in concert with the with financing mechanisms for directing capital towards real estate investment, and in the ways that people, the members of society were gaining wealth and gaining access post-war, and making choices of how to expand their freedom of movement, so to speak. And all of those were interacting together. And of course, I will just point loosely towards the automobile industry and the petroleum industry. And, we can make a broad reference to the fact that there was a lot of growth happening in both of those as well. And to say that these are not deeply intertwined with the very car-centric expansion of suburban sprawl in the US would be, ridiculous. Of course they are. They're deeply intertwined. And so those policies are still, they are an intricate web, and there's stratification of those from scale to scale. And so undoing that sort of policy reinforcement is a key way that the new urbanism can promote more of the alternative, because what we know is that the ability to create the alternatives is necessarily impacted in every one of our practice every single day by policies that are, fundamentally getting in the way of a more walkable urbanism. So that's sort of the big broad, like, why is that the landscape? But there's also something very important about the era that our movement is in, which is that in the earliest stages of new urbanism, like I said, there was the need to simply prove the model, to simply prove that you could design and develop an entire community that was walkable and that had buildings close to each other, even touching each other, complete phenomenon in that era of the 80s and 90s, buildings couldn't touch. But that you could put, row houses together, and people would actually choose to purchase these row houses, even though it meant that they were going to have a party wall with their neighbor, that there was a market, that people actually wanted to live this way. And that people would willingly park, a big, it sounds silly to say innovation, but a big innovation was demonstrating that people would willingly park their car in one place that wasn't directly inside their home, that you didn't have to have, the car actually become a part of the living space in and of itself, like an extra family member. And then not one car, but one car per driving adult, right? Demonstrating that you could separate the car, the attachment to the car, a bit, that you could put a garage along an alley in a single family home and people would still walk from their garage into their house, or that you could co-locate parking in the center of a block so that all of the, sort of attached liner buildings around that block could sort of share in that parking storage, but people were happy to do that and then bring their shopping up into their home. Those were radical ideas. And so the early stages of urbanism were proving that could happen. And the landscape where that was possible was anywhere where there was a community willing to let a crazy developer do something different. And so many, many times that involved sort of working outside of standard policy. And there were mechanisms at the time, planned unit developments, if it was a greenfield project in the middle, unsurrounded by urbanism, sort of out on its own, that you would go through a PUD process, as it was called, and they still exist. But that was your means, because you could basically if you could convince a municipality as a developer or as a designer that you would set your own rules, and the municipality would go for that, then whatever you did within there was your own problem. And if your development failed, so be it. And many of the earliest examples of new urbanism were those greenfield projects. Or alternatively, they were in infill conditions where the city had some common interest in seeing a different type of development and seeing a less car-centric type of development. It might have been replacing, some existing urbanism that they wanted to keep a consistent sort of character and environment to. And that was a long period of sort of the growth and expansion of new urbanism. And then many of these ideas became more common. Average home builders are that may not be dyed-in-the-wool new urbanists, are responding to a market that knows that better quality neighborhood environments exist because these models have been built. And so again, these average home builders that maybe don't think too hard about what the principles of the Charter of the New Urbanism are, but they're thinking about what their market wants, and they are finding that the policies inhibit their ability to provide, what the market's looking for, just as much as, when someone who has grown up in the new urbanism has, learned at the feet of some of the earliest thinkers, has a deep knowledge of why these principles are successful, is maybe really hunted through the research and has really interrogated these ideas. That individual and an average home builder who just wants to be able to respond to an ever-changing market, and that ever-changing market has learned that there are alternatives, that it isn't simply a single family house on a quarter-acre lot with one car per driving adult, and everything is dislocated. Every use, every activity of your day is dislocated from the next. That market, there are still many Americans who might make that choice, but there's a whole lot more recognizing that there's an alternative that would like that alternative. And the thing that is one of the systems that is most restrictive to creating more of that alternative are the policies that exist at every level of governance.
That is a very good explanation. Thank you. I did notice the issue around party walls. I didn't know in the States if you did have what we have as party walls here, which is a wall with a kind of assumed midpoint. Do you have this? Like, so for example, I'm sat up in the attic space of my house, and my party wall is the same wall as my neighbor's. And the bricks it's 1 brick thick. So it's 202 millimeters or 8 inches thick. And 4 inches down, there's a kind of tacit line. But I discovered in Holland, and I've not dug around and seen if this was true in every situation, but in those lovely parts of places like Amsterdam that we look at with its varied urban housing typologies, they don't have party walls. Everybody builds walls up against each other. So you can knock houses down without disturbing the neighbor. If I knock my house down, my neighbor's house would fall over.
Yeah.
So it's quite interesting at the level of policy on something and cultural policy that as you say, it has to be unpicked both at the giant scale of the interstate, right down to the scale of how you persuade people that sharing a wall and how you persuade planners to persuade developers that sharing a wall is not going to lead to litigation, I suppose.
Well, yes. And that's, I was going to say that in many cases, particularly in new build, that the solution to that will be to develop, specific covenants around the building itself, and that in order to purchase in, you're agreeing to a certain set of standards, a certain set of operating principles, so to speak. A miniature homeowners association, if you will. And that, that varies, certainly depending on what the state regulations are, what, sort of local comfort level with some of these things might be, or what the developer's comfort level is, and how he or she is going to be able to sell this product. The thing I will say, though, that I would add to your list of the complexities there is people relearning how to live that way. And that, I mentioned there's a heck of a lot more folks in the US in particular, as I say this out loud, that's who is the audience I'm thinking of, who have sort of refound their love for cities and their love of city living. But that does not necessarily come with an embedded knowledge of the social aspect of what that entails, the sort of, the benefits and drawbacks, the things that you learn to live with, and the opportunities that you get as a result for that. Not everything about city living is convenient. There are times where, the public transportation is not running for some reason, and though you rely on it, that particular subway line, that particular tube line is closed for some reason or another, and now your day just changed because of that. And that's quite different than when you have a personal vehicle and that's how you're moving around. And also, anyone who has owned a personal vehicle has probably gotten at least stuck in traffic, if not had, an accident of some sort or another, and that also changes your day. It's a trade-off. It's a different form of the convenience versus liability that any choice of living somewhere might have. And so, when you're talking about party walls and, how you manage that, certainly there's aspects of, instructing construction to make that easier or more difficult that, come into play, building code sort of issues. But I also would argue that, even going beyond the policy to just the comfort of having to negotiate with neighbors, having to manage those interpersonal relationships that they may not be deeply intimate, but your proximity forces you to, have to negotiate that relationship as a result.
Seems to me that the new urbanist model fundamentally requires a refinding of a an organic and holistic idea of what it is to be a sociable human being.
Yeah.
It's been very interesting listening to you talk about the level of research that goes into exploring possibilities for and assessing the value of new urbanist interventions. My gut feeling with a lot of these sort of rather storied examples of high modernism from the post-war and mid-century year, where that there's a good, strong philosophy, egalitarianism, cleaning out the clutter of inner cities, whatever it is. Didn't seem to be much evidence that it was based on. And new urbanism seems to me to be much more evidence-led, much more responsive, which I think is a really, well, it sounds really good, but it's a very difficult sell because it's bloody hard work.
It is. And I will add another layer to that, which is the rigor of understanding that this movement has attempted to embed into its practical, application, now has the added body of evidence of a generation worth of this work, these test models in real form. I, for a period of time, about 15 years, I actually lived in one of those early New Urbanist greenfield projects, one of those examples. And it is still to this day a standalone community. It is not where the property was quite outside of the nearby town, and the growth has not stretched to where it is. And so, you can kind of identify it as a pretty good research model, right? It is what it is, right? And having lived there, I got a firsthand look from my own personal life at these ideas that I knew were embedded into the design, and the sort of intentionality, the argument of why we make certain design decisions in common urbanist practice. I got to see that play out firsthand. And I can tell you that is a beautifully designed project, very well executed. I can tell you an awful lot about it anecdotally, and can tell you that it would be an amazing, it has been for people a really interesting, research topic. But also what I recognize, having that lived experience, is that it is as important for us as a movement, to be fully understanding the consequences of these design interventions as it is to understand the consequences of past design, or the sort of evidence that leads us to these design priorities. Because, to your earlier point, those historic models may be highly successful today, but the decision making was done in a time where many ways that we live in a modern world was not even loosely an idea. Things like smart home technologies, or different, using different energy sources, and balancing between those. And so I want to make sure that the new urbanism is not, that we carry that same rigor into interrogating our own work, really exploring what this body of evidence shows us. And so a big, you would have seen in the strategic plan, an important priority for us is expanding both our, holistic understanding of the movement and its trajectory over time, but also then analyzing the work that has been exemplar of that movement, and learning from that research in order to improve our practice going forward.
One last question, and I suppose it relates to my previous question. I think it was Robert Venturi who said, when asked about some urban design scheme to make plazas in some American city, said Americans don't need plazas, they should be at home watching TV. Which is a good comment.
I
Uh,
mean,
I mean, I hope he said it, because otherwise,
you're right.
yes, speaking ill of the dead. But I wonder, is it possible? And it comes back to one of the early points you were talking about, this idea that a more, for want of a better word, indigenous architectural form, a more contextual architectural form.
Mhm.
Is it possible for us to replicate models from the past without replicating the social structures that those architectures came from? Or perhaps to invert the question, is it meaningful for contemporary people to try and replicate the past?
Mhm. That's probably an entire podcast unto itself of discussion, I would say. But
Well, you got 2 minutes.
yeah, right. What is the short answer there? No, I think what you're talking about there is a sort of fundamental intentionality towards awareness and the distinct desire to not only repair past harm, but not to perpetuate future harm. And so, I'm using harm in a very dramatic sense, but honestly, the stakes are pretty big in the urban realm. Climate change is a global challenge that will destroy entire places. And in my work, I have been lucky enough to work. I shouldn't say lucky. The unfortunate circumstance of places that need good design help are in places where the changing climate may cause them to cease to exist, for that land to cease to be there, for the sea to take that place over. Those existential level of challenges require us, it is necessary that we are broadening our understanding of our own impact in whatever that design decision might be. Yes, to improve place, to improve people's lives, to the ways that design can really elevate the human experience. All of that is very important. But if we're doing so in service of perpetuating future harms, we're just kicking this, problem that we perhaps have solved in the moment on down to the next generation or the one beyond that. And so the responsibility cycle is so broad at this point in human understanding, and climate and inequity are so the globalization of those challenges is fundamental to why. And so I think that can sound very big and heady, but at the end of the day, really focusing on the well-being of humans and the design that we're creating is, sort of the platform from which all the rest of that decision making, all the rest of that contextualization, all the rest of that responsibility bearing can come from.
That's a great point to finish on. Thank you very, very much, Mallory. It was wonderful to hear you talk.
Oh, thank you so much. It was a pleasure to do this.
What is the city but the people? Asked Shakespeare's Sicinius, mirrored I suppose in that strange marketing slogan, people make Glasgow, a get out of jail card for bad architecture and planning. Anyway, the point is moot. Thanks to Mallory for a splendid conversation and for taking the time to speak with me. It's much appreciated. Links to her and to the CNU are in the podcast description. Thanks for listening.